Hey man, welcome everybody to the 65th edition of the EGlaze Chronicles. I am your host, EGlaze, and I'm proud to welcome someone I've known for a few years now, a friend of friends, and but mainly she's one of the people I like to go to about things such as what we're talking about today. And it's timely that we did a show like this today because I don't know anybody. I think everybody should go read it. If you haven't had a chance to read Kevin Love's new article about what he's talking about his mental health. Um, it's a serious thing, and it's been a serious thing in sports for a while. And there's no better person I would like to talk to about it than the sports psychologist. I call her Dr. Kensa Gunter. How you doing, doctor?
Thank you so much. I'm good, and thank you for the invitation to be here. How are you?
I am great. I am great. I am great. So, we've been in the pandemic. We've been all shuttered and stuck in the house. So, talk to us about some of the people you talk to, your patients. How they handle it, because athletes are a different breed, and sports athletes and sports people in general are a different breed, and this has to have drove a lot of them up the wall. So what are some of the things you're hearing about this during the pandemic and how they're dealing with this?
So I think it's interesting, right? Because athletes are different and unique in many ways, but they're also human, right? And they're human first. And so I think in the same, we have all been navigating uncertainty and the unprecedented times that we find ourselves in. I think athletes have been dealing with that too. Certainly, if you go back to March when the world shut down, right? Think about March 11th. Sport was really one of the industries that resulted in that global shutdown, right? The NBA decided to stop. And so I think the athletes, like I said, being that they're people first, they've been dealing with the loss of their sport, right? The health concerns, trying to navigate the racial injustice. And as time has gone on with the return of their sport, right, trying to still navigate these dual pandemics that we're living with in terms of the racism and COVID, while also now trying to compete and take care of their families and stay healthy and safe. So I think they are like us. They're trying to figure out how to navigate this new reality while also performing on a global stage, right? And so that becomes a challenge that we just have to navigate.
And through this, we've seen that they've also had to, sometimes I think people forget that they are human and we expect more out of our athletes than we normally, I don't know, we should or whatever. But from the pandemic and expecting them to be able to figure out a way to play, to a lot of the athletes now having to lead the way on these social injustices. To be an athlete in today's time, what are some of the things that you have noticed? Or do we lean too much? Are we leaning too much? How are they able to deal with this themselves? Because the world looks upon, especially athletes and at the higher level, to be not only our spokesman and play a great game and entertain us, but they also are now in these days and times. I mean, we've always seen it, expecting them to be leaders per se, even though we say they're not role models, but they are kind of being expected to be role models.
Yeah, it's a very interesting life to be, just trying to figure things out for yourself and to try to create a stable life for your family, and also to be thrust in the spotlight in a way that the world gets to see what your life looks like, to an extent, right? And to your point, to be labeled as leaders, to be labeled as advocates and activists, that's certainly not new. There's been an intersection between sport and activism as long as we can think of, right? All we have to do is look back in history and we can see many ways in which that crossroad has resulted in athletes sometimes being the loudest voices for social justice and for advocacy and for change. And I think, we're seeing some of the similar things now, because sometimes when you have a platform, a public platform, your voice is able to be amplified. And I think what we're seeing is not only athletes using their voices in their platform, but they're also amplifying others' voices who may not be able to be heard as often. And they're amplifying issues that they think are really important. To go back to what I said a moment ago, they're people first, right? So a lot of these athletes that we're talking about identify as Black or of African descent. And so in that, these issues are personal, right? It's not just them advocating for some issue that is not relevant to them. Like, these issues are very, very relevant to their own life, especially as we think through the racism that is currently at the forefront of some of the social justice conversations. Most of the athletes in many of our in basketball, in the NBA, the WNBA, NFL, most of those athletes identify as Black, right? And so, and those are some of the athletes that we see leading the charge. We certainly see those in Major League Baseball. Hockey took a stand a few weeks ago as well. And so, not to say that other sports aren't representing tennis, Naomi Osaka with her wearing the mask, right? I think athletes are realizing the power of their voice and using it to elevate these causes that are not only important for society, but that are personal for them.
Are you surprised at the way that they're still able to compete without the fans in the stands?
Yeah.
Go ahead with that. What's your thoughts on that?
I was gonna say, it's probably different, right? But let's think about it. Athletes are also really resilient, right? And they play and they participate because of their love for the game or because of what it allows them to provide for their families. So I do think that there's likely a uniqueness to the environment without fans present. But I also think we can't underestimate their passion and the competitiveness that lives inside of them, right? And when you get on a court or when you get on a field and it's you against your opponent, you know, for a competitor, you don't need anybody to be there watching you, right? Like it's all you need is an opportunity, right, to showcase what you can do. And then we've seen very creative ways that leagues have tried to address the lack of fans, whether it's cutouts or virtual fans, crowd noise that they are inputting into the stadiums and the arenas. And so I think, you know, it's different, but again, athletes are resilient and they know how to make adjustments. And I think that's what we're seeing.
During that period of time when there weren't any sports, from probably March till, I say May-ish, what were you hearing from some of the athletes that you have to deal with? What were they climbing the walls? What were some of their mindsets? Were they just ready to play? They were training, but you couldn't train so much because you didn't know what was out there. So you still missing that competition. And, you know, these are younger men and women. So they are, you know, those older people, we were all right just going home and relaxing. But the younger ones, they like to get out and do things. What were some of the mindsets of being unable to do during that time for them?
I think there were a range of responses, right? I mean, for some athletes, they were in their off season. And so the idea of continuing to train was still in line with what they would have been doing during that time period anyway, right? For others who had to shut down play, you think about certainly some of our pro sports, but our college sports as well, like that had to shut down, some of our high school sports. I think for them, that was a loss initially, like a significant loss. And then we think about our Olympians who were training for the Tokyo Olympics. And then it gets postponed, right? And so that goal that you had in mind, that goalpost has now been moved. And so I truly think that there was a range. There was loss, I think, from not being able to compete or train in the way that you wanted to. For some, again, they weren't in season, so that wasn't too far off from what they would have been doing. And I think what we saw with all of them was make the adjustment. Right? Because we can't change the reality of the situation. All we can ever really do is change our approach to the reality that we're in. And so I think that's what you ended up seeing. And for some of the athletes, you know, interestingly, and people might not think of this, but they had an opportunity to spend time with family and friends in ways that they would not normally have the opportunity to do. And so for a lot of them, it was, you know, a break from competition that certainly they didn't ask for, but that they made the most of by using that time to really connect and be present with their family and friends in a way that they might not have ordinarily had a chance to do.
You deal with athletes from multiple levels, and you can see from the high school, from the college to the pros. What has been some of the things that you've noticed from our younger kids and what they were dealing with during this time? I mean, we're getting out there and we're playing, but there were issues and things that they were dealing with and trying to, you're a teenager, you're young, you're trying to figure it out, and you're still trying to figure out life, and you can't play. What were some of the things you were finding with them and seeing with them through this?
Yeah, I saw a greater sense of loss with the younger athletes, right? Because for a lot of them, it's their escape from different stressors and things that they might be experiencing in their families. It's their release, right? It's an opportunity for them to connect with their peers and have fun, right? And so they lost that all with the shutdown of sports. I think the other thing that was really interesting that didn't get a lot of conversation, but I think was really important, for some of our younger athletes, right, our high school students, middle school students, they only have access to some of that sport equipment and some of those sport arenas when they're in school. So when we shifted to a virtual situation, you had some kids who didn't have access to their sport venues, right? There were no basketball goals or baseball fields in their neighborhood. They didn't have equipment at home that they could use. So for some who still might have had access, whether they had a basketball goal in their driveway or they could use something in their community, they still were at least able to engage in some activity. But for those kids who come from family situations where there's a different reality, they not only were cut off from participating in organized sport, right, but they didn't even have that physical outlet once they got home because that just wasn't a part of their environment, right? When we think about those who come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, access becomes a real concern and a real issue. And so I think trying to manage that loss with trying to then figure out what other activities can we do to kind of keep you engaged, I think that was a real challenge when the pandemic first hit and in the first few months of the pandemic. Now I think you do see teams getting back together, at least virtually, but that initial shock of everything shutting down really was impactful for our younger.
I don't even know if you can measure this because I don't even know if it's real to measure, but during this time for athletes, did you see an uptick in depression? Did you see more of a with all the racism and the pandemic and unable to play with teammates and play the thing that you love? I don't know if you're able to measure it. I don't know if you can give me numbers or anything like that. But from what you have been able to see, is it just natural to believe that it was an uptick in depression, an uptick in being down and not being, being hurt by this? Because this is tough. This is a tough period of time.
So I can't necessarily measure it for just the athlete population, but what research has shown is that in general, for all of us, there have been increased reports of anxiety and depression and increased experiences of feeling traumatized by the racialized violence that we saw. And I don't use the word trauma lightly. It is very traumatizing to see someone who looks like you or someone who you can identify with be murdered on video. Right. And so to see that racialized violence really was traumatic for people, not only just witnessing, but it also may trigger thoughts of other hurts and losses that a person has experienced in their life. And so just across the board for all of us, the situation that we found ourselves in is very abnormal. None of us could have predicted this. And even the person who may have never experienced challenges as it relates to their mental health before might have found themselves feeling very stretched and taxed in that way. And so it would be, it's very common for people to experience increased anxiety when we're dealing with increased uncertainty and increased unknown factors that affect our day-to-day life. It is understandable that people may experience more sadness or depression when you have the loss of sport, the loss of hallmark moments, no birthday parties, no graduations, no celebratory moments where you would normally get together with people. You may have actually lost loved ones to the virus, right? We often miss that those numbers that we see on the screen. Those include numbers of people who have had the virus, but also numbers of people who have lost their lives. And so many people have lost their lives as it relates to this. We would understand an increase in sadness and depression around that. And like I said, racial trauma is a very real thing. And so not only thinking about Black people and African Americans and the racialized violence that we've seen, but also in thinking about Asian American communities and how they were very stigmatized and discriminated against and attacked in some ways, particularly verbally, because of the coronavirus itself. And so, there's been a number of challenges that we have experienced throughout this year that absolutely have affected people's mental health. And what I think we're seeing is a greater recognition of the importance of attending to mental health, recognizing that it is something that we need to be very mindful of and that we need to give more respect to because it affects all of us. And we need to be intentional about taking care of our mental health and well-being.
I want to get your thoughts on what the NBA and WNBA did with the wobble and the bubble and their thoughts. The reason why I bring this up is, I'm seeing what mental health is and I know what people deal with. And Paul George recently came out when he was talking about his play. He said the bubble wasn't really doing things. It was affecting him, being away from family, being confined like that. Some people thrive in it. Some people just want to play the game, like you said. But for others, it was not the norm. There wasn't a fan. There wasn't a family you can go home to every night. It was going home to a hotel room. Have you heard anything about that? Or some of the people that were able to play down there? I've had contact. Some people say it was good for them. just to be able to play the game that they love. And some people said it was different, and you missed the fans, you missed the togetherness. What were your thoughts on what Paul George said and what he, his play wasn't that great. People have said some things about it, but what are your thoughts on what he said and some of the things he felt that he went through in that situation?
Yeah, again, I think kind of generally speaking, the bubble and the wubble were extremely unique situations. And I think one of the first things to just be aware of is that the situations were set up with safety in mind, right? So that the games could be played. And so I think it was extraordinary, actually, what they did, that they created an environment where people could come together and actually end up playing. And they're still playing, right? And it was high quality basketball. I mean, if anybody has paid attention to the playoffs here in the last couple of weeks, it's been some very entertaining basketball, but that has come at a but that has come at a sacrifice, right, to those who have left their families and agreed to be in this confined situation for an extended period of time. So when we think about the comments that Paul George may have made, or comments that any of the athletes have made, again, I think what it reflects is the fact that athletes are people first. And even if you put all of them in a similar situation, they're unique individuals who are going to respond differently. Different people have different coping strategies. Different people thrive in different situations. And I think being in a situation like that, we just saw the differences in how people responded. I recall him saying that he experienced depression and anxiety. And I would caution us to judge that negatively, because we wouldn't want anybody to judge us, right? And so him being willing to say that, I think, is important. Now, there are some that have said, well, he just said that because he wasn't performing well. But the reality is if you do experience mental health concerns, it can affect your performance in very specific, direct, and noticeable ways. And so I don't think we can judge how that situation affected someone. All we can do is respect what they say, right? And then appreciate that he noticed it and took steps to get assistance and help in dealing with that, right? From his coach, from his teammates, from his support system, from trained mental health professionals, right? That's the thing that I think we can take from it, is he was in a situation and recognized that he needed more than he had within himself to give, right? And he reached out and got the support that he needed. And so I think, again, that's a lesson that all of us can take from that experience and situation that he willingly shared with us.
And I agree, because a lot of the athletes had to deal with not only that, but they, with all the, racial injustice going on out there, they couldn't be a part of it. They had to do what they were doing inside, you know what I'm saying? So they couldn't reach out and do anything. They couldn't say anything. If you're a father with sons, you're worried about what's going on with them, or your parents, like you said, who are older, could catch it. You have to stay inside. I heard there was some that lost parents and grandparents while they were down there. So, it makes sense what you're saying. Do we expect too much of our athletes still, in your opinion?
I think because they are extraordinary in their fields of play, what we sometimes do is we erase their humanity, right? Because they're so good as athletes and performers, I think sometimes that results in us seeing them as invincible or superhuman. And in that, we erase their humanness, right? And we forget that they are people, right? I think that's the biggest thing that I see us doing, is that we, you've heard the phrases as it relates to social justice and advocacy, like shut up and dribble, or just stick to sports, right? And it's kind of like, but they're citizens, right? Who have a right, their First Amendment right to free speech, right? And they are people who are affected by these issues that they are speaking up about and that they're speaking out against. They're calling for change and equality, not for a society that they're not a part of, but for a society in which they're trying to live and work and exist every single day. So I think that's the thing that we do, is we dehumanize them, and that's on us, right? That's not on them. So I think it would be important for all of us to just sometimes step back and say, you know what, if I was on a platform, on a stage, in a fishbowl where I was just trying to swim and live my life, and the world was watching me from the outside judging, right? Would I want them to judge, or would I just want them to let me swim, right? And so I think that sometimes is what we need to recognize, is just because they're in the public eye doesn't make them any less human. It doesn't give us the right to criticize and judge their lives, because we wouldn't want that. We wouldn't want anybody to do that to us either.
I think what's also amazing to see is to see the the ones who have stepped. I'm just thinking, I'm a little older in age. I don't think I would see this type of social activism from my athletes 20 years ago. You wouldn't see an Osaka, a Naomi, doing what she did, wearing the names of the fallen African Americans who have died by police brutality. You would see a LeBron James who would have been told to shut up and dribble. He might have shut up and dribble. Or Colin Kaepernick. I just think this younger generation have showed. Have you been impressed, or have you seen an uptick in more athletes saying, you know what, we do need to get more involved? The vote challenge that they are doing, I think it's been very impressive. Like I said, I've been seeing sports since I was a youngin in the 80s, 90s, and 2000, and I know athletes have taken a different stance than what they used to. Have you seen that, and what are your thoughts on that?
Like I said earlier, I certainly think that there is a history of the intersection between sport and advocacy. And certainly we might have to go back to the days of Jackie Robinson and Arthur Ashe and Wilma Rudolph and thinking through the ways in which they were advocates in their own right. I think the world that we live in is a little bit different now, right? So if I think about a couple of decades ago, right, there may not have social justice issues. I don't know if they were at the front of the conversation in the way that they are now, right? That's not to say that there weren't social justice issues that we needed to address, but I just don't think they were as prevalent and as top of mind in society a few decades ago as they are right now. To answer your other question, I am absolutely impressed and in awe and inspired by the athletes who are using their voice and using their platforms to talk about very real issues that affect us all. It takes a lot of courage to do that, whether you're an athlete or not. It takes a lot of courage to step out and speak up for what you believe in, knowing that everybody may not agree with you and that you may get criticism by the bucket loads coming back your way. So I am inspired by them. And I think that they are reflective of a generation that realizes the power of their voice and is also realizing the power of their collective voice to speak out across professional sport platforms. You see college student athletes who are also engaging in activism. You see high school students who are engaging in activism. And so I think what we're seeing is a generation who understands their voice is powerful and their collective strength is powerful. And I think social media is allowing us more access to all of these acts of advocacy in a way that we also might not have had 20, 30 years ago, right? Like we might not have been able to see in real time what was going on across the world in the way that we can now with the advances that have happened in technology. And so I'm impressed, I'm inspired, and I'm grateful to them for keeping these conversations at the forefront of the discussion.
I think you answered what I was going to ask. The next question: has social media driven that per se? Because it looks like that's been a big thing, that this younger generation have handled this new technology better. Like we didn't have that 20, 30 years ago. So now they've grabbed onto it. They understand it. They know they're going to get criticism if they don't or they do. So they just say, you know what, let's do it and let's keep it going. So thanks for answering that about the social media. I think that's been
well. And let me say one more thing about that, because I think the other thing about that is like my generation, we're the digital immigrants. Like I remember a time when there was no Facebook or Twitter or MySpace. I'm dating myself, right? But I remember when there wasn't that, when the cell phone was actually in a bag and not just a little bitty device that you could put. Like I remember that. So our generation are the digital immigrants, meaning that we immigrated from a world without that technology into a world that has it. This generation, they are digital natives. They don't know a world without all of the technology that we have. And so it's a very different relationship that they have with technology, and they see it as a communication tool and a way to get their message out and a way to communicate and a way to amplify whatever they want to amplify, right? Whether it's the latest TikTok dance that they want to do or whether it's a social justice issue. And so I think that too is a difference, is that they have a different relationship with technology than generations of the past.
Yeah, I had to write those two things down. Digital immigrants and digital native. I have got those written down because that is amazing to think about it like that. But we immigrated into this area, our generation, and my daughter was born in this generation, into this, so they know it a little bit more. So that's awesome. That's a great way of putting that. let's talk about you a little bit. You know, you're one of the premier, in my opinion, in the sports psychology field. How long have you been doing this now? So people out there, for my new listeners who might be listening, how long have you been doing this?
Yep. So let's see. So I have been, if I go back to my internship and postdoc, which is where I first started doing my doctoral level training, that was in 2006. So we would say about 14 years now. I've been licensed here in Georgia since 2007. So I've been licensed for 13 years and been doing the work for 14.
Yeah, University of Georgia grad, by the way. Just let everybody know.
Yes,
that.
Go Dogs. Yep.
Go Dogs.
Gotta put that out there. And Athens native. You know, Athens is my hometown.
That is correct. That is correct. What is it about this field that intrigued you so much? This sports psychology world? Because, like with Kevin, I think it's amazing that we went so long without people realizing that our minds. We always talk about football as 90% mental and 10% physical, but you know, you can talk about it because it is 90% mental. And what made you intrigued to want to jump into that?
So my first interest came in the area of psychology. My Psych 101 professor made psychology seem like it was the greatest thing ever, just kind of studying human behavior and trying to figure out what makes people do the things that they do. So I was intrigued by psychology my freshman year. And I actually was going to pursue forensic psychology. So I was really interested in the intersection between psychology and the law. And so I went and pursued a master's degree in forensic psychology and did a master's internship at a couple of different actually in the Atlanta area. My master's externship was at Metro State Prison, which was a maximum security women's prison here in Atlanta. And so, and as strange as it is to say, I mean, I enjoyed the work and I enjoyed trying to give something to others who could see themselves as being in a hopeless situation. And it was while I was doing that externship that I found out about the field of sports psychology. My mentor there kind of introduced me to that field. And myself growing up, I was a swimmer and I played basketball. And I always loved sports. So I just kind of looked into that field and it seemed like a really good fit. So then when I went into my doctoral studies, I focused on clinical psychology with a concentration in sport because for me, it felt like athletes were a population who were really in many ways kind of negatively stereotyped. They were viewed as the privileged few who had access to all these resources and all these perks, and they were never really discussed or treated as the people that they are and the stresses and the challenges that they may experience being in these elite performance spaces. And so initially I wanted to work with injured athletes. That was kind of my focus area. And then African-American athletes and thinking about the intersection between sport and mental culture. And so ultimately, I love being in this field because I do love being a part of the group who's trying to give something to the athletes and trying to offer something to them, offer support to them, help them navigate life, who focuses on the person, not just the athlete. And so that's really what draws me to this work. And that's the passion that keeps me going from day to day and doing the work that I do.
How have you grown in the field that you've been able to do? What's been what you've seen since you first got into it? What's been the thing that you've seen grow for you in the field as well as the work itself since you've been in it?
Yeah, I think the opportunities probably have grown. When I started out, I was working in college spaces. So I was working on college campuses with college athletic departments because that was really where most of the concentrated sport communities were, right? Within college athletics or within the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. That was the place where they existed. And over the course of the years, what I've seen is more awareness and interest in providing mental health and mental performance resources for athletes across all levels. And so I'm sure you and your listeners may know last year and the year before, between those 2 years, 2018 and 19, the NFL and the NBA have come out with requirements that say that each club has to have a relationship with a licensed mental health professional, right? That's new. Again, that's happened within the last 2 years in both of those leagues. And there are many teams in Major League Baseball who have mental performance consultants that are a part of their staffs that work with their players. And the same is true across the board for other sports in terms of different athletes being very vocal about seeking mental health support or working with a sports psychologist for mental performance needs. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is that mental health and mental performance in sport has come out of the shadows, and it has become a part of the conversation as opposed to something that's never discussed or only discussed in secret. And with that understanding that the athlete is a total person, right? And we can work on the physical, but if we're not working on the mental, we're missing a huge part of what contributes to their health. I think that has created more opportunities and more openness for us to look at ways in which we can provide mental health support in sports spaces. And so for me, it's gone from working at a college campus and doing individual and some teamwork to continuing to do individual and teamwork, but also doing a lot more consultation services with different organizations and different teams, and providing education about mental health and mental performance, as well as services. And I keep saying athletes, but I would be remiss if I didn't also say one of the changes has been expanding beyond the athletes, providing support for the coaches, right? Providing support for referees, providing support for anybody who's in the athletic space, because they too are in that highly pressurized environment, and they need support as well, whether it's our performance staff, from our athletic trainers and strength and conditioning coaches, right? We don't think of them as being people who might be in need of support, but they're people too, and they're in the same high intense environment, high energy, intense, high performance, high expectations around productivity environment. And so really just trying to provide support for the sport environment, I would say, is the bigger way that it's shifted over the last several years.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because a lot of people don't realize that sports is it takes a team off the court just as much as it does on the field and court to make it go. And I think that's a lot of the things that people don't realize. And so I'm so glad you brought that. But, Doctor, I want you to just let us know, where are we headed with this? I think more athletes are speaking about their mental health. Are we seeing them getting better? They're learning more about themselves with this process. Or are we seeing athletes getting healthier? Everybody thought healthier was just if your bones would heal up or your neck spasms will go out but now we're seeing athletes are trying to get healthier with their mental health. Are we seeing that trend happening with these athletes? Are we seeing it happening more? And I think it's good to see it from the pro level, because it's beginning to trickle down to college and then eventually to the high school. So these athletes at different levels will understand that is a very important thing that you need to have, is your mental health.
Yeah, I think, yes. I mean, I think what we're seeing is sport as a whole is recognizing the need to be healthier. And to your point, what we see at the Olympic levels and the pro levels trickles down, right? And so when I'm working with my high school students, it becomes, how are you balancing sport with the rest of your life, right? How are you creating an identity outside of just the identity wrapped up in who you are as an athlete, right? How can we help you to develop as a person so that by the time you get to the pro level, we don't have to then figure out, well, who are you outside of sport? But we can start that conversation early, right? And it's so interesting because youth sport has become so specialized, and it's almost like a miniature pro league. You don't even have seasons anymore. Like, you have sport that's all sports feel like they're year round, and they're so expensive to participate in some of these sports that some families have been priced out of participating in sport, right? And so I do think, as we think through mental health and how it intersects with sport, again, more pro athletes talking about it causes us to think about it at the younger levels. And at the younger levels, what we need to do to address mental health concerns may look different there than it looks at the pro level. But the fact that we're now thinking about it and looking at it, I think is really important. And so I think it's tremendously healthy for athletes to talk about their challenges as it relates to mental illness, or to share their coping strategies and how they deal with difficult things. Because if we can normalize the conversation about mental health and communicate that message that it's okay to not be okay, then we can also look to normalize seeking help when you need it. And that's where the healthiness comes into play. When people are willing to seek treatment for what they're dealing with, then we can create healthy people. And if we have healthy people, we'll have healthy athletes. And healthy athletes and healthy coaches create healthy sports systems. So yeah, I think we are seeing a change. We still have work to do, don't get me wrong. Like, we haven't arrived anywhere, but we're certainly seeing movement in a direction towards health and looking at the total health of a person, which includes mental health.
Thank you so much for this. This is very much needed. There is much work to do, so I'm sure more people will want to know where they can find you to keep this going. So go ahead and tell them where they can look you up and find your information, Instagram, websites, all that. Go ahead and tell people where they can find you.
So let's see. So my website is drkensa.com. So that would be drkensa.com. That same statement, Dr. Kensa, is also my Twitter handle. And so that's @drkensa. You can find me there. I'm also on LinkedIn. I think as Kensa Gunter. There might be a doctor in front of that, but I imagine there are not many Kensa Gunters. So if you see the name on the screen and you look that up on LinkedIn, and 3 primary ways to find me and get a hold of me.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. This was much needed. I'm glad to have this conversation. And I just, being around sports all the time, I worry about this part a lot more now, especially what you just mentioned about the specialized sports that we're seeing our younger people in and having to do. I remember I used to, I'm aging myself, I look forward to seasons. I knew fall was football, spring was basketball, and this. So I knew what was going on. Now it's like I see year-round baseball. I'm like, what is that?
Yep. And I think the other thing that's really important is that if you look at some of the athletes who we look to as being great in their fields, they were multi-sport athletes when they were younger.
Yep.
They participated in 2 or 3 sports when they were growing up. They didn't just specialize. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there for us to work with our youth sport leagues and our youth sport organizations to create healthier kids as well.
So before I go, I have to ask this then. Are we seeing that these specialized sports cause a bigger stress on the younger kids? Because now if you specialize in that sports, it's almost like we expect you to go to school or college in that sport, if we're going to specialize in it.
Yes, we are definitely seeing that. I see that a lot in kids who feel like they have very little choice. Like success in this particular sport is their only option because there's been so much investment for them in that sport. The other thing that we're seeing with the specialization is overuse injuries and an increase in overuse injuries at a younger age, because when you are engaging in one sport year round for consecutive years, you're overusing those bodily movements and joints and muscles in a way that you would not overuse if you were diversifying your movements by participating in different sports. So the overuse injuries, the increased pressure that we're seeing, and perfectionistic tendencies that we're seeing in kids, and then the identity that is so much defined by their sport, the intense athletic identity, I would say, are 3 of the things that we are seeing that again affects mental health. But again, that's where our opportunity lives in order to really intervene and talk about mental health in a real way that helps these kids to be healthier people.
Dr. Kensa, everybody, go visit her. Dr. Kensa, KENSA.com, Twitter and LinkedIn, Dr. Kensa. I thank you so much for being my guest. I appreciate it. Stay on when we end. When I go live, I got to ask you another question off the air.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for everybody who joined us. This will be out there on YouTube, Facebook. Check it out. Enjoy it. For those who got it late, check us out. We'll be back next week with another show. We got a couple of good shows next week we're going to jump into. We'll tell you about it this weekend. So thank you. And like I say, continue optimizing your vision, and we'll talk to you later. Have a good day.